For 20 years, Margaret thought she was living the American dream. A devoted wife in suburban Connecticut, she raised 3 children, volunteered at the church, and never questioned why her husband Charles always seemed distant in their most intimate moments. She trusted him completely, but on a cold December evening, when she discovered what he'd been hiding in their bedroom drawer, everything shattered. What she found was so humiliating, so devastating, that it drove her to pick up a kitchen knife and end their marriage forever. Charles Matthews died that night on their bedroom floor, bleeding out while Christmas lights twinkled outside their window. But this wasn't a crime of passion driven by jealousy or money. The secret that destroyed their marriage was something far more personal, far more crushing to a woman who had given her entire adult life to a lie. Margaret had discovered that her husband had been deceiving her about the most fundamental part of their relationship for 2 entire decades, using a hidden medical device that made her question everything she thought she knew about their intimacy. The truth wasn't just shocking, it was humiliating. And it left Charles dead, Margaret in handcuffs, and 3 children orphaned on Christmas Eve.
Dark Stories. True crime is your home for chilling crimes, unsolved mysteries, and the darkest secrets the world has to offer. We uncover shocking cases, disturbing truths, and mysterious disappearances. Hit subscribe and join us.
Margaret and Charles Matthews seemed to have it all. Married for 20 years, they were pillars of their community in the quiet town of Millfield, Connecticut. Friends described them as the perfect couple, high school sweethearts who never lost their spark. But behind closed doors, Margaret was living with questions she never dared to ask out loud. Why was Charles always so controlled during their intimate moments? Why did he never let her touch him in certain ways? Why did he always insist on darkness and specific positions that felt rehearsed, almost mechanical? For 2 decades, she told herself these were just quirks, maybe shyness or cultural differences from his conservative upbringing. She never imagined that every single intimate moment of their marriage was a carefully orchestrated performance, made possible by a medical device he hid so well that even sharing a bed for 7,000 nights, she never suspected the truth. How could a man deceive his wife so completely? Why didn't she leave when she finally discovered the truth? And what exactly was Charles hiding that was worth killing for? These questions would soon unravel a marriage, a family, and ultimately, 2 lives forever. Margaret and Charles met at Millfield High School in 1998. She was 17, captain of the debate team, with dreams of becoming a lawyer. He was 18, quiet and thoughtful, working part-time at his father's auto repair shop to help support his family. Their love story seemed straight out of a movie. Charles would wait by her locker every morning with coffee and a handwritten note. He never missed a single one of her debate competitions, always sitting in the front row with a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite flower. They married right after Margaret graduated from college in 2002. She had been accepted to law school at Yale, but Charles was struggling to find steady work, and his mother had just been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. Margaret made what she thought was a temporary sacrifice. She deferred law school for a year to help Charles care for his mother and establish their life together. That 1 year became 2, then 5, then forever. By the time Charles's mother passed away in 2007, Margaret was pregnant with their first child, Emma. Their neighbors on Maple Street remember the Matthews family as the embodiment of suburban success. Charles eventually built a successful landscaping business, Matthews Garden Design, that served some of the wealthiest families in Fairfield County. Margaret threw herself into motherhood and community service, organizing school fundraisers and coaching Little League. Every summer they hosted the neighborhood barbecue. Every Christmas, their house was the one with the most elaborate decorations. Charles would spend weeks setting up displays that drew visitors from 3 towns over, but there were small cracks in the perfect facade that Margaret learned to ignore. Charles was intensely private about his body, never changing clothes in front of her, always showering alone, even after 20 years of marriage. Their intimate life, while regular, felt strangely impersonal. He was attentive to her needs but never seemed to lose control or show vulnerability. Margaret sometimes felt like he was following a script, hitting all the right notes but never truly letting her in. When she tried to bring up these concerns, Charles would deflect with humor or change the subject. He'd say things like, "Some people are just more private, Maggie. You know I love you." And she did know. She never doubted his love, just wished he would let her love him back completely. Friends described Charles as devoted but reserved. He was the guy who remembered everyone's birthday, who would drop everything to help you move or fix your car, says neighbor Janet Rodriguez. But even after knowing him for 15 years, I felt like I only knew the surface. He was friendly but never truly opened up, even to the men in the neighborhood. Margaret's sister Linda noticed it too. Charles was wonderful to Margaret and the kids, but there was always this invisible wall around him. I used to joke that he was like a perfect husband designed by committee. He hit all the marks, but something felt rehearsed about it. December 22nd, 2022, started like any other day in the Matthews household. Margaret dropped the kids at her sister's house for their annual pre-Christmas sleepover, a tradition that gave her and Charles one quiet evening to wrap presents and enjoy each other's company before the holiday chaos. She spent the afternoon finishing her Christmas shopping at the mall, picking up the last few items for Charles's stocking stuffers, cologne, and his favorite dark chocolate truffles. She returned home around 6 p.m., expecting to find Charles setting up the artificial Christmas tree they bought that weekend. Instead, the house was silent. His truck was in the driveway, but he didn't respond when she called his name. Margaret assumed he was taking a nap. He'd been working long hours finishing landscaping projects before the winter break. She decided to surprise him by starting dinner, his favorite pot roast with carrots and potatoes that always made the house smell like home. As she seasoned the meat, Margaret realized she needed the good carving knife, the one Charles kept in their bedroom dresser because their kitchen knife block was missing a slot. It was an odd place to keep a kitchen tool, but Charles was particular about his knives being properly stored and sharp. She climbed the stairs quietly, not wanting to wake him if he was sleeping. The bedroom door was slightly open, and she could hear strange sounds coming from inside, rhythmic movements and what sounded like muffled breathing. Margaret's first thought was that Charles might be sick, maybe struggling with something. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. What she saw in that moment would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. Charles was on their bed, engaged in what appeared to be an intimate act, but something was wrong. The angles were wrong, the movements were wrong, and when she looked closer, she realized why. He was using some kind of device, a prosthetic enhancement that was so realistic, so detailed, that it had fooled her for 20 years of marriage. The shock was so complete that Margaret didn't initially react. She stood frozen in the doorway, watching her husband of 20 years engage in the most natural human act using artificial equipment. The device was sophisticated, flesh-toned, and clearly expensive. This wasn't some novelty item. This was medical-grade equipment designed to create the illusion of normal intimacy. Charles hadn't noticed her yet. He was completely absorbed in his private moment, and Margaret realized she was seeing him unguarded for the first time in their entire relationship. When Charles finally noticed her standing there, the look on his face wasn't shame or embarrassment. It was terror. Pure animal terror. He scrambled to cover himself, knocking over the bedside lamp in his panic, but it was too late. Margaret had seen everything. She had seen the prosthetic, she had seen the elaborate setup, and worst of all, she had seen the collection of photographs and documents he kept in the open drawer beside their bed, evidence of a deception so complete it made her question every moment of their life together. "Margaret, let me explain," Charles said, his voice shaking. But Margaret was already backing away from the bed, her mind racing through 20 years of memories, recontextualizing every intimate moment, every time she had wondered why something felt different but trusted him anyway. The pot roast was still cooking downstairs, filling the house with the smell of their normal life, while upstairs, everything she thought she knew about her marriage was disintegrating. At that moment, Margaret knew her marriage was a lie, but she hadn't yet decided what to do about it. The decision was made for her moments later, when rage, humiliation, and 20 years of suppressed doubts crashed together like a perfect storm. She walked calmly downstairs, turned off the stove, and picked up the carving knife she had originally come upstairs to find. When Millfield police received the 911 call at 8:47 p.m. on December 22nd, they expected a typical domestic dispute, maybe a holiday argument that got out of hand. Instead, they found Margaret Matthews sitting calmly at her kitchen table, still wearing her Christmas shopping clothes, with blood on her hands and a carving knife placed neatly beside her purse. "I killed my husband," she told Officer Michael Torres when he entered the house. "He's upstairs. I've been waiting for you." Charles Matthews was found in the master bedroom, having bled to death from multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. The scene was bizarre, Detective Sarah Chen later testified. Charles was partially clothed, and medical equipment was scattered around the bed. "In 15 years of homicide investigation, I'd never seen anything like it," Detective Chen recalls. "The wife had clearly discovered something that sent her into a rage, but what we found in that bedroom took hours to fully understand." The prosthetic device was sophisticated, a custom-made medical apparatus that would have cost thousands of dollars. Police found receipts dating back to 2003, just 1 year after Charles and Margaret were married, showing regular payments to a medical supply company in New York that specialized in devices for men with erectile dysfunction and other intimacy-related medical conditions. There were instruction manuals, maintenance supplies, and even backup devices. Charles had been living with this equipment for nearly the entire duration of his marriage, and the level of preparation and deception was staggering. But the most damning evidence was found in Charles's personal papers, hidden in a fireproof box in their basement. Letters from doctors, insurance claims, and medical records revealed that Charles had suffered a traumatic injury in a motorcycle accident when he was 19, just before he started dating Margaret. The injury had left him with permanent physical limitations that would have made normal intimate relationships impossible without medical intervention. Instead of telling Margaret the truth, he had chosen to build their entire marriage around an elaborate deception. Margaret confessed immediately and in detail. She waived her right to an attorney and gave a 4-hour statement to police that same night. "I don't regret killing him," she told detectives. "I regret wasting 20 years of my life on a lie. Every time we were together, every time I felt close to him, every time I told him I loved him, he was performing. He was acting. He stole 20 years from me, and he stole my chance to make a real choice about my life." The media seized on the story immediately. "Wife kills husband over bedroom secret" dominated local news for weeks. National news outlets picked up the story by New Year's Day. Margaret's calm demeanor during her confession, her lack of remorse, and the bizarre nature of the deception fascinated people across the country. Talk shows debated whether Margaret was a victim or a murderer. Social media exploded with arguments about deception in marriage, medical privacy, and the right to know the truth about your spouse. Neighbors were stunned. Janet Rodriguez, who had known the family for 15 years, told reporters, "Margaret was the kindest woman you could meet. She baked cookies for everyone on the block. She watched our dog when we went on vacation. She never raised her voice even when the kids were acting up. If someone had told me she would kill a spider, I wouldn't have believed them. To think she could kill Charles, there's just no way any of us saw this coming." If you're still watching, type "I'm still here" in the comments so we know who's following every twist of this unbelievable story. The trial of Margaret Matthews began on September 15, 2023, almost 9 months after Charles's death. By then, the details of the case had become public knowledge, but hearing the full extent of Charles's deception laid out in court was still shocking. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the urologist who had treated Charles for over 20 years, testified that his condition was the result of severe trauma from a motorcycle accident when he was 19. The injuries had left him unable to have normal intimate relationships, but with the right medical equipment, he could maintain the appearance of normalcy. Mr. Matthews was deeply ashamed of his condition, Dr. Martinez testified. He was young when the accident happened, just starting to explore relationships. The psychological impact was severe. He became convinced that no woman would want him if she knew the truth. The prosthetic devices we prescribed weren't just medical tools for him, they were his way of feeling normal, of having a normal relationship. But the prosecution argued that Charles had gone far beyond using medical devices to manage a disability. He had built an entire relationship on deception, making intimate decisions for Margaret without her knowledge or consent. Prosecutor Amanda Walsh presented evidence that Charles had multiple opportunities to tell Margaret the truth. Before their wedding, before they had children, before they bought a house together. Each time, he chose deception. This wasn't a man trying to cope with a disability, Walsh argued. This was a man who decided that his fear of rejection was more important than his wife's right to make informed decisions about her own life. He stole her chance to choose whether she could handle his condition, whether she wanted to build a life with someone who required medical assistance for intimacy, whether she wanted children with a man whose condition might be genetic. He took all those choices away from her and made them himself. Margaret's testimony was the emotional center of the trial. She spoke for 3 hours about the slow erosion of her self-confidence over 20 years of marriage. "I knew something wasn't right," she said, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "I'd ask him if everything was okay, if he was happy with our intimacy, if there was anything I could do differently. He would tell me I was imagining things, that everything was perfect, but I felt rejected, inadequate, like I wasn't enough for him. I went to therapy thinking there was something wrong with me as a woman, as a wife." She described years of feeling like she was failing as a partner, wondering why Charles seemed emotionally distant during their most intimate moments. "He was so controlled, so careful. I thought maybe he didn't find me attractive anymore after I had the kids, or maybe I was doing something wrong. I bought books. I tried to talk to him about it, but he would always shut down the conversation. Now I know why. He couldn't risk me finding out the truth." The defense argued that Margaret had suffered a complete psychological breakdown upon discovering the deception. Dr. James Harrison, a forensic psychologist, testified that learning your entire intimate relationship was based on deception could trigger a dissociative episode. Mrs. Matthews wasn't just discovering that her husband had a medical condition, Dr. Harrison explained. She was discovering that every intimate moment of her adult life had been a performance, that the man she thought she knew didn't exist. That kind of revelation can cause a complete break from reality. But the most devastating moment of the trial came when the prosecution revealed that Charles had planned to tell Margaret the truth. Hidden in his personal papers was a draft of a letter dated December 20th, just 2 days before his death. In it, he apologized for the deception and explained his medical condition. He wrote about his fear of losing her, his shame about his disability, and his desperate desire to be normal. The letter ended with a proposal to renew their vows, this time with complete honesty between them. Margaret broke down completely when the letter was read in court. "He was going to tell me," she sobbed. "After 20 years, he was finally going to tell me the truth. And I killed him 2 days before he worked up the courage to do what he should have done 20 years ago." It was the first time she had shown genuine remorse, and it changed the entire dynamic of the trial. She didn't just kill her husband, she killed the man who was finally ready to trust her with the truth. The jury deliberated for 6 days before reaching a verdict. They found Margaret Matthews guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not murder. The distinction was crucial. The jury believed that Margaret had acted in the heat of passion upon discovering a deception so profound it temporarily destroyed her ability to think rationally. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. But the real revelation came during the sentencing phase, when Charles's medical records were fully disclosed. The prosecution had held back one crucial piece of information during the trial. Charles's condition wasn't just the result of his motorcycle accident. Medical records from 2019 showed that he had undergone successful reconstructive surgery. For the last 3 years of their marriage, Charles no longer needed the prosthetic devices. His continued use of them was purely psychological. He had become so dependent on the deception that he couldn't break free from it, even when it was no longer medically necessary. Dr. Martinez testified that she had recommended Charles tell Margaret about the surgery and his recovery. "I told him that he could have a completely normal, intimate relationship with his wife now," she said. "The physical limitations were gone. But he said he was too afraid she would leave him if she found out about the years of deception. He was trapped by his own lie." This revelation reframed everything. Margaret hadn't just been deceived about a medical condition, she had been deceived about a condition that no longer existed. For 3 years, Charles had been using medical equipment he didn't need, continuing a deception that was now purely about his fear and shame, rather than any physical necessity. The tragedy became even more pointless. Charles had died for a secret he no longer needed to keep. The impact on their children was devastating. Emma, now 20, Jack, 17, and Sarah, 15, had lost both parents in one night. Charles was dead, and Margaret would spend their remaining childhood years in prison. They went to live with Margaret's sister Linda, but the stigma of their father's deception and their mother's crime followed them. Emma dropped out of college, Jack struggled with depression, and Sarah refused to speak about her parents at all. In prison, Margaret became a model inmate. She earned her GED, then a bachelor's degree in social work through a correspondence program. She started a support group for women who had been deceived by their partners, recognizing that while her response was extreme, her experience of betrayal was more common than people wanted to admit. "I don't excuse what I did," she said in a prison interview in 2024. "Charles deserved a chance to explain, deserved a chance to make things right. But I also won't pretend that 20 years of deception didn't damage me in ways that will never fully heal." The case sparked national conversations about honesty in marriage, the ethics of medical privacy, and the psychological impact of intimate deception. Marriage counselors noted that deception can be even more damaging to a relationship than infidelity, as it makes partners question their sense of reality. Charles had created a reality where Margaret's instincts about their relationship were consistently invalidated, where her concerns were dismissed, and where she was made to feel inadequate for sensing that something was wrong. This wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the explosion of 20 years of suppressed doubt, 20 years of feeling like something was missing from her marriage, but being told she was imagining it. When the truth finally emerged, it wasn't just the deception that destroyed Margaret. It was the realization that her instincts had been right all along, and she had been gaslit into ignoring them for 2 decades. The Matthews case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about truth, deception, and the foundations of intimate relationships. Was Charles a victim of his own shame and fear, trapped by a lie that started as self-protection but became a prison? Or was he a manipulator who chose his own comfort over his wife's right to make informed decisions about her life? Was Margaret a woman driven to temporary insanity by devastating betrayal? Or was she a murderer who chose violence when she should have chosen divorce? The truth, like most truths in cases this complex, lies somewhere in between. Charles was both victim and perpetrator, a man whose disability and shame led him to create a deception so complete it destroyed everything he was trying to protect. Margaret was both victim and perpetrator, a woman whose 20 years of suppressed doubts exploded into violence when the truth finally emerged. Neither of them was entirely innocent, neither was entirely guilty. What makes this case particularly tragic is that it didn't have to happen. If Charles had told the truth before they married, Margaret might have chosen to stay and work through his medical challenges together. If he had told her after his successful surgery, she might have been hurt, but ultimately grateful for his honesty. If she had insisted on answers during the 20 years when her instincts told her something was wrong, she might have discovered the truth in a less devastating way. But fear, shame, and the human tendency to avoid difficult conversations created a perfect storm that destroyed 2 lives and shattered a family. The children, Emma, Jack, and Sarah, represent the real victims of this tragedy. They lost their father to his own fear and their mother to her own rage. They are left to make sense of a family history that includes both profound deception and profound violence, to figure out how to trust and be trusted in their own future relationships, despite the example set by their parents. Margaret Matthews destroyed the man who deceived her, but in doing so, she destroyed herself too. She will spend the prime years of her life in prison. Her children will grow up without either parent, and Charles will never have the chance to make amends for 20 years of lies. In trying to preserve his marriage through deception, Charles guaranteed its destruction. In trying to punish his deception through violence, Margaret guaranteed her own. What do you think about this devastating case? Was Margaret a victim of 20 years of lies, or was she a murderer who chose rage over reason? Could you forgive a partner who deceived you about something so fundamental to your relationship, or would the betrayal be too deep to overcome? How do we balance the right to medical privacy with the obligation to be honest with our partners? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story as shocking and complex as we did, wait until you hear about our next case. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories that explore the dark side of relationships and the devastating consequences when trust is broken.